Beginning actually a new sermon series, as Pastor Andrew has alluded to, a cross-centered community, which will carry us for the next 4 to 5 weeks. And we're going to look at various passages in the Bible that talk about the essential need and the life-giving reality of a gospel-centered, cross-centered community. And before we look at the passage for today's message, I want to share a little bit about what was the heart behind this short sermon series. And much of it is going to be our current and present circumstances. Community is something that the church and Christianity has always talked about, even at New Life Press. We've always talked about how important community is. But I think because of the events of the past year in the pandemic, in-person, face-to-face, physical, flesh and blood community has been highlighted as such an important need in ways that probably many of us have never thought about or experienced before. Tim Challies, in his book, The Next Story, talks about how it makes the argument that being created in the image of God means that the most natural environment for community is face-to-face, physical, in-person presence. That's our most natural way to communicate, a natural environment for community, because we are meant to be coram Deo before God and made in the image. We are meant to be before each other face to face. And all other forms of community and communication are good and in themselves, the phone call, the text, the email, social media, but they are all in some ways a second place compared to in-person, face-to-face community. And I get it, friends, community is also tough when we think about developing new friendships and dealing with other people and their sins. So on the one hand, the Bible will say community is so innate to the way he designed humanity that community should be natural. It's needed, inasmuch as we were created to eat and to breathe, inasmuch as work and vocation is a natural part of humanity for us to flourish, that community also is a part of that reality. We are created innately to be communal people. But yet sin has ravaged that reality. And so what we have now is this weird tension where inside there's a level of frustration and anger. There's a loneliness. There's a natural gravitational pull towards community. And yet all of us, I would imagine, would have a story or a moment where we had a lot of heartache, a lot of disappointment, a lot of hurt, a lot of frustration with community. So there's this weird tension where we gravitate towards it, and yet it scares us and we've been hurt by it. And so the next sermon series that we're going to consider in the next 4 weeks is how do we begin to process all of that? How do we see the essential need of community? How do we deal with the messiness of community? What can I do so I could get through life? Because if God created this world so that community is innate, then how do I relate to community that is cross-centered? And so we're going to kick this off with Romans chapter 12, starting with verse 9 to all the way to 16. This is our passage. So go ahead and open up your Bibles. Let me read this for us. Romans chapter 12, verse 9. Let love be genuine. Abhor what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. Love one another with brotherly affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Do not be slothful in zeal. Be fervent in spirit. Serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope, be patient in tribulation, be constant in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints and seek to show hospitality. Bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be wise in your own sight. And this is God's word for us, friends. Community is an interesting word. If you just look up the root word of community, the etymology of community, it comes from com, which means with or unity, and it comes with this idea of cultivating a group mentality and friendship, a life together, but it also comes from the root word that you are grouped in together doing things side by side. In other words, there's a unity, but there's also a withness, if I could put it that way. You have a unity with or a common union. And we're going to discuss what this common union is and what this unity with looks like for the church and for those who follow Jesus Christ. And in this passage in Romans 12, chapter 12, verse 9 through 16, we have, according to my count, about 20 to 22 different commandments. And it almost seems like a random list of do this, don't do this, live like this, relate to each other in this way, about 20 to 22 commandments. And we can't get to all of this. And in some ways, it's not easy to group these different commandments about community all in nice, tidy headings. So what I'm going to attempt to do is to highlight 4 major themes that I believe characterize this cross-centered community. 4 characteristics, 4 adjectives, 4 realities that get at the heart of what the Apostle Paul is trying to touch base upon. So we're not going to get to every commandment here, all 22, but we're going to consider 4 major ones that I think capture the major highlights and shades of what this cross-centered community looks like. And these are the 4 adjectives, 4 aspects, 4 realities, 4 perspectives, 4 applications of cross-centered community. 1, a cross-centered community is sincere. Secondly, it's affectionate. 3rd is hospitable. And 4th is empathetic. So what does a cross-centered community look like? It's sincere, it's affectionate, it's hospitable, and it's empathetic. So let's look at this together. First, a cross-centered community is genuine, it's sincere. The buzzword for today and this day and age is going to be authentic. People love the word authentic. You want to be real, you want to be honest, you don't want to be fake about this. And that's exactly right in its heart. Because the Apostle Paul says that the church, a cross-centered community, should be sincere, a community that's actually quite genuine. And you can see this in verse 9, and the Bible translates this as, let love be genuine. But literally, if you look at the Greek, it says this, the love sincere. The love sincere. There's not even a verb there. You sort of supply it. And this is the theme that runs throughout the entire passage up to verse 21, the love sincere. So in some ways, all the other verses indirectly talk about how this cross-centered community is a love sincere. And that's how Paul starts off his understanding of community, friends. In other words, to give a context of Romans, in Romans chapter 12, verses 1 to 2, he says we're transformed in our thinking by the gospel. And then in verses 3 to 8, we're transformed in our service to one another, using our gifts to build each other up. And then in verses 9 to 16, we're transformed in our character. So our minds in verses 1 to 2, our actions in service in verses 3 to 8, it says this is your heart. This is the flavor. This is the character of your community at church, the love sincere. And so that's why we'll consider this as really the theme of the entire verses, because Paul is basically saying this, friends. What I'm about to write, that's the type of community I want you to be in. This is the type of community I want you to cultivate. I want you to be a community like this. I want you to cultivate a community like this. I want you to be part of a community like this love sincere. And friends, that word there, love, is a word that many of us are familiar with. If you've grown up in the church, it's a word called agape love. And you don't want to stretch, the different types of Greek words for love too much, but there are certain nuances, I think. And agape love is usually, more often than not, related or talking about God's love to people. It's sacrificial, it's costly. It's a grace-based, other-centered love. So that agape love is the love shown to us in the cross in chapter 5, verse 8. That agape love is a love poured out into our hearts in chapter 5, verse 5. Agape love is the same type of love that never lets us go in chapter 8, verse 39. Agape love. And for the first time we see in verse 9, Paul uses that word agape in relation to our love with one another. Because usually it's vertical, but now he says it also channels itself horizontally. And agape love, friends, between one another is sacrificial. It should cost you something. It's other-centered. It's something that inconveniences you at the very least, but causes you to lay down your life, perhaps to the point of death, in the most extreme expressions. That's agape love. That's the love that Paul says should characterize the cross-centered community. This love sincere, because God sacrificed his son to love us, and in the power of the gospel, we sacrifice for one another, and that should be our greatest source of joy and satisfaction to love our brothers and sisters, our family, across our community with this agape love. A grace that's transformed us and a grace that'll transform our relationships. Friends, what Paul says here is this agape love, this sacrificial, this expensive love that costs you something, should be genuine, should be sincere, authentic, the love sincere. Literally, that word means a love that's not hypocritical. Hypocrites, if you didn't know the context back then, hypocrites is really a reference to actors in Greek theater. So whenever they play different parts, they would put a mask on, and they're called hypocrites because they weren't being their true selves. Because obviously they're acting, they're playing a part, they put a mask on, they're role playing. And sort of over time, that word takes on a negative connotation, so that hypocrites are basically people who are fake. Because you put a mask on, you're not your true self. You're not authentic, you're inauthentic. You're not showing who you really are. So when you're saying the love sincere, this agape love that's sincere, it means take your mask off. Show people who you really are. Be authentic and genuine. Because when you're fake, and if we're honest friends, many of you, including myself, we're oftentimes in our sin fake about our love and affection. We put on masks, we pretend we're holier than we are, we think we're more loving than we should be, especially pastors, if I'm going to be honest, because we're supposed to be the most loving people. But yet, in our sin, we're oftentimes not very sincere. We are love insincere. We're love hypocritical. We put on a mask and we role play. And that's a challenge, friends. The guiding thrust that characterizes a cross-center community is a sincere, genuine, authentic love. To take your masks off. And the gospel transforms you in such a way that you have the love and the ability, the sincerity to be vulnerable and take off whatever mask that you want to put up. The mask that says you're competent, the mask that says your life is perfect, the mask that wants to hide the fact that your marriage is really broken and lonely, the mask that hides the fact that you have a lot of skeletons in your closet, the mask that hides the fact that you're insecure about your performance, about your work, about your academic credentials. All these masks that we put up, we want to take off and say that this is who I am. Identity in Jesus, so that we can love one another sincerely and authentically. That's a community that is cross-centered. That's a community that God says is real and sincere without hypocrisy. John Stott has once said this about this verse. For love is not a theater. It belongs to the real world. And my question, friends, is this morning, do you love in the real world as real people with your masks off? Or in this real world, is it just simply a stage and you're constantly loving in the theater? Because some of you, I would imagine, are really good at loving in the theater. And you're not too good at loving in the real world. And some of you are really good at loving in the real world. And we want to encourage and embrace that and cultivate that much more. And the challenge here is saying, stop loving in the theater. Love in the real world. One practical question to consider before we go on to the second characteristic is that if this agape love that's real should cost you something. And so you just ask yourself, reflect, in your relationships, in your community at church, have you ever sacrificed anything? Have you ever spent anything? And I'm not talking about your money. I'm talking about just sacrificing with your life. At least to a small, have you been inconvenienced? Whether it comes through service of the church, whether it comes organically through another need you hear about a member of a church, through community groups, have you been inconvenienced? An inconvenience and a sacrifice, a cost, comes out in a lot of ways. Sometimes it messes up your schedule so that the nap time for your kids isn't exactly at the time that you want it. Sometimes you're just tired, but you feel compelled that you're going to sacrifice your sleep so that you can love someone else. Maybe the hardest one is this. I have to sacrifice because my comfort zone. I'm an introvert. The pandemic made me more introverted. I don't want to sacrifice and engage in community because it's hard work. I love my safe little place, being isolated at home as an individual introvert. And so you don't want to sacrifice inconvenience or being in an awkward position because you know what? You have to talk to people. You have to engage with other people called Homo sapiens, made in the image of God. And so you don't want to sacrifice that. But agape love a love sincere, you got to sacrifice something. Sacrifice your comfort, your schedule, your money, your gifts, your time. You have to sacrifice something, at least to inconvenience yourself. That's the challenge here, because God sacrificed his son Jesus for you, that empowers us and transforms us. You know what? To find this oddly otherworldly joy that we can sacrifice for one another. Agape love, a love sincere. That's something for you to think about. In this sort of, if I push the analogy, transactional relationship, are you an investor in people because you're sacrificing, you're giving yourself to people, or are you a receiver of people? Are you a giver, like we repented corporately, or are you a taker? When you just honestly look at your relationships, are you always just sad people didn't sacrifice for you? Are you a taker? Are you a receiver? Are you a benefactor? Or are you actually going to be a sacrificer? Are you going to be sacrificial? Are you going to be a giver? That's something that you have to kind of challenge yourself to be honest with yourself, because if you're honest and you find yourself to always be a receiver, a taker, then there's something that you potentially could repent of. Because a cross-centered community is a community where everyone is an investor, a giver, a sacrificer, someone who authentically, without a mask that you put on, generally just, here I am with all my skeletons, all my brokenness, vulnerability, I'm going to inconvenience myself for the community, because there's a great resource and joy that the only way I can make it in life is if I live out this cross-centered agape love. So let's look at the second characteristic. It's not just going to be sincere. Not just that, but a cross-centered community is going to be affectionate. Affectionate. Now, what does that word mean? Well, look at verse 10. It says it right there. Love one another with brotherly affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. We're going to focus on that first part of the verse. Love one another with brotherly affection. Now, all the commentators make this note, which means, and tells me at least it's pretty important. Love one another with brotherly affection actually has two words for love. The one word is there for love one another, and there's a second word for brotherly affection. And both those words for love and brotherly affection come from the same root word of philo, which conveys the sense of family relationships. So there's philostorge, which means love one another, but there's also brotherly affection, which is Philadelphia, where we get this. So that's where we get our city, that famous city back on the East Coast, is brotherly love, Philadelphia. But then you also have this love that's a deep, intimate, affectionate love called philostorge. And according to the commentator James Dunn, this is his opinion, but he's a renowned scholar. He says, a storge, which is a root word, is a love generally between parent and child. Now, some say it's between husband and wife. In either case, there's a deep family love here. And so one of the things that we recognize is that a cross-centered community should be like family. This natural, affectionate, family-like love. And this love that's both Philadelphia and philostorge. This love that should be natural. We're like an extended family bound together in brotherly love. Now, what I want to highlight is this. So I spent a lot of time looking at this, looking at the words, reading different books and commentaries, looking at the dictionaries, lexical and biblical dictionaries. And that word for love there, as I mentioned, comes from philostorge. And in its most basic sense, storge means this: devoted, bound together. And it also means, across the board, affectionate. So it's a little bit different than just agape love, which is this sacrificial, other-centered love, because definitely storge is sacrificial, other-centered, but it's this sort of everyday, common affection. Affectionate. It's a different aspect of love that comes from the gospel, because love is so rich. It's affectionate love. In other words, I think what this concept is trying to get at is this. There's an automatic connectedness, because it says, in its most basic sense, you're devoted, you're bounded. It's not something that you have to create as much as you just live out. It's not something you just discover, like friendship love. His friendships, you have to discover. You're saying, you like this, I like this. We have the same interests. Or you connect with a friend and say, hey, our conversation goes well. I like your humor, you like mine. It just feels really natural, doesn't it? And you discover friendships, but that's a little bit different from here. Here, family love has to be automatic. You don't tell a mom to a child you just gave birth, Okay, now you got to develop this relationship and grow it. Certainly parent-child love, it does grow, it does develop, but once a mother gives birth to a child, it's automatic. And yes, I know there are always outliers, and sin has ravaged this world, so sometimes parents don't love their children, and I know that there's always the outliers and exceptions, but naturally in God's design, a parent naturally loves a child. It's already there, it's automatic. They're bound, they're connected. A mother and child has this automatic connection just simply from their family relationship. And he's saying, you know what? That automatic connection, that automatic boundedness, this affection that parent has for child is also something that a cross-center community should have, even between people who just met each other. There's this innate sense in the gospel that we are connected, that we are bounded. There's this affection. Let me try to draw this out. Let me try to explain to you what I mean. Other loves or friendships have to be discovered. But this love, this storge love, philostorge, is natural and automatic. Now, C.S. Lewis expounds upon this in his book, The Four Loves, and this is how he tries to explain this affectionate storge love. This is what he says, and I'm just paraphrasing him a little bit. We automatically are bound up with one another because all of us are bound up in Jesus Christ. And C.S. Lewis says this, storge, affection, covers an array of loves. Like animals, the care of a mother to babe is a picture-perfect expression of affection. It relies on the expected and the familiar. Affection is humble. Storge love is affection almost slinks or seeps through our lives in the everyday matters. He says it's like it lives with humble undress, private things like soft slippers, old clothes, old jokes, the thump of a sleepy dog's tail on the kitchen floor, the sound of a sewing machine. All these natural everyday realities that we take for granted provide a comfort of familiarity, a natural bondedness, a boundedness, an affection. That's what he's trying to get at. He's saying, in other words, put it this way. If you meet the love of your life, like in those romantic comedies, and there's fireworks in the skies, and there's an affection, you have this chemistry in your heart beats, that's not really storge love. That's not affection. Affection is the everyday kind of love. This warmth and comfort, this sense of security, this sense that says, oh, I really like this. I feel comfortable and I'm at home in this relationship, in this community. In other words, this affectionate love of philostorge means that you are just as comfortable being by yourself, the security and comfort of being alone, but you realize that comfort is in the midst of a community because that community is characterized by philostorge, an affection. That's why Lewis tries to capture the everyday realities of this. It's a comfort in which you have a friend that you meet after 20 years, but you pick up right where you started and the jokes make you laugh again. It's that comfort to say, oh, I love the sound of the sewing machine or the rain that patters on top of the roof, or I love the fact of the smell of the coffee that I have every morning. All of those realities try to capture the sense of what philostorge is, this affectionate love. It's the familiarity of the people with whom you have been thrown together in family. The familiarity of the group of your college friends, or if you're a war veteran, your army pack, or the people that you're on ship with. It's the religious house, according to C.S. Lewis. The affection for people always around us, the normal day-to-day life. The majority of love we experience is really some expression of this affectionate love. It binds people, friends, who otherwise would not be friends. Do you get that? Let me end on this before we go to the third characteristic. If you look at church, there's within your discipleship group, your community group, it's just a wide variety of personalities and experiences, a wide variety of people that come together. And they come together because it's a community centered on Jesus, which is our theme for this year. But if you get the heart of it, I think what Lewis is trying to say is that the ground for all other community, the reason why diverse people come together and have different opinions, personalities, ethnic backgrounds, upbringing is because of this gospel-centered storge love. Now, even if you look at our church, I don't know if you realize this, but the staff at New Life Press, in some ways, in personalities and also demographics, are very diverse. If you look at the staff, you basically have 4 middle-aged people, myself and Director Kathy, church admin Amanda, Director Gower. You have 4 middle-aged people, and then you have 3 younger guys who are like just strong and youthful, and they're young, they're millennials. So basically, you have sort of, Gen Xers on the one hand, and then you have like 3 other males who are sort of millennials, but we operate like a well-oiled machine. How is that possible? How in the world can you have 3 millennials working well with Gen Xers to operate and serve the church in the way that we do? Well, storge love. There's an affection. There's a sense that we know each other's idiosyncrasies. We know what we like. We know what we dislike. We know people's eating habits. The New Life Press session often is similar too. Now, not many of you have sat in a session meeting, and so we added 2 recent elders who are creating this all over again, but there's a diverse group of personalities, even by our jobs and our natural temperaments. You have one particular elder who's extremely extroverted and just, big vision, and loves to talk, and he's so gifted at that and just very creative. And you have those who are more like quieter and contemplative. They sit there and they think and they mull over things. You have those who are very corporate in their thinking. You have those who are very compassionate and empathetic. And you have diverse personalities and bents. But how is it that in the session we could serve and lead the church in the way we do? Storge love. It's a love that just characterizes the affection, the things that we like to do, the things that we like to talk about, our idiosyncrasies, things that make us unhappy. That's supposed to characterize a cross-centered community. That's what we have to recognize that should characterize your life. You have to be surrounded by people who are different from you. And the reason you can still resonate and jive with them is because of storge love. Now let's consider this. So you have agape love and you have storge love. Well, let's move on to the third one. How does this get expressed practically? I think it's because cross-centered community is also hospitable. Paul continues and says, just touching upon this, he says, don't be lazy, be full of zeal, be fervent. He says this very quickly in verse 11. The word fervent there means a passionate bring to a mind that is at the boiling point. So it's not just going to be stoicism complacent. No, Christianity is very passionate. You're fervent in the sense your mind is boiling. And he says, you know what you do when you have this gospel-centered boiling point, fervent in verse 11? What do? Be hospitable. Pray. Be other-centered. That's what we're going to look at in verse 13. Paul says, take this boiling pot of your passion into practical action. Contribute to the needs of the saints and seek to show hospitality. Now, I just want to give a couple of words about hospitality. Contribute, that word in verse 13 is where we get the word koinonia, which is the word for fellowship. He says, we want to have fellowship. The word koinonia also is almost always is about community, that it involves material giving, material needs of sharing. And here, this fellowship has a material focus again, and it says, real Christian fellowship, genuine Christian community, is a community where material and practical needs meet one another. So you can't just have a community just in terms of sharing burdens, which is probably more important, I would say, but you can't really dichotomize. But you have to have a community that also is practical. You open up your home, you open up your goods and services, you open up your material needs, and you share this with one another. That's what hospitality is. But friends, I'm going to make you a bit more uncomfortable, because that's what the Bible does, and it makes me more uncomfortable too. We have to look at what hospitality pushes us to do even more. Paul says, if you want to share your material needs, it expresses itself in hospitality. And back then in the early church, that was crucial to the mission of the church, because many of you know, traveling preachers, missionaries, they depended upon the hospitality of other Christians to open up their homes so missionaries could sleep there. Now, it's not the way that we do it here today, where we know our commissioned missionaries, we set up the schedule. These are strangers. Because you see, friends, the word for hospitality is actually a word that means philoxenia, which is a love for strangers. And that means there's a difference. There's a difference between entertaining and hospitality. Now, hospitality will involve entertainment, perhaps, and entertainment and hospitality is so crucial, friends. It's really a gift, and you should know how to entertain and show your goods and services and open up your home to your friends and loved ones. That's essential too, but hospitality is going further. It's opening up your home to strangers, and that's really tough. It's a community that overflows in your practical expression to people you don't really know. The commentator William Lane says this, hospitality, this word highlights the joy in the guest-host relationship. In this relationship, there can be an exchange of gifts that brings encouragement to one another. I love what one pastor, former pastor, I guess, Eugene Cho has expressed it this way when he talks about ownership of the church. He says there's a difference between a guest and a host. And what hospitality is trying to get at is this. One is the love for strangers, but two, in Christ, it means that you always consider yourself as a host, that you have ownership not only of the house of God at the church, but also you're a host with the resources and blessings that God has given you, with your house, your physical and material needs. Many of us always take on the view and the mentality of a guest. We want to be served, we want our needs met, our particular preferences asked about and spoken into. But what this is getting at is saying a cross-centered community transforms you. In the gospel, you are always a host. You are always someone who opens up your home to other people. Now, friends, we're thinking, how in the world am I supposed to do that when, in California at least, we have a stay-at-home order and we want to be careful and love our neighbor? Absolutely right. And I encourage people to be thoughtful and to be other-centered when you think about this. But here's what we can also consider. I know you can't open up your home and show hospitality in the same ways that you normally could. But I want to say at least this. That verse there, verse 13, seeks to show hospitality, means that you pursue it. Before you actually do it, you pursue it, you seek it. And what that tells us is that before hospitality is an opening up of your home, it's an opening up of your heart. Actually, real hospitality, which is a qualification for leaders, is not just opening up your resources, it's first and foremost opening up your life, opening up your heart, opening up your thinking, opening up who you are, your identity. You give yourself before you give your things. And that sort of presupposes seek hospitality. That means you want to do it, you're pursuing it, you're looking after it, mean that in your heart you're ready to do this. And in some ways, even as we continue to meet virtually, even as your CGs meet through Zoom, that in some ways you could show hospitality in the beginnings of it, because even though you can't open up your homes, you could certainly open up your hearts. Because the greatest, most hospitable people are not just those who are good at entertaining, they're good at opening up the doors and giving the keys to your heart to show what's going on in there. Hospitable people open up their houses, but hospitable people open up their hearts as well. And that's something that we could think about as we move forward together as a church. Last but not least, cross-centered community is sincere, is affectionate, is hospitable, but last but not least, a cross-centered community is empathetic. Empathetic. And you're thinking, where do I get that? Because I don't see the word there. Well, the word isn't there, but the concept, the exhortation, the commandment is clearly there. It's in verse 15. Read that with me. Rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. Rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. That's just a better way to express the concept of empathy. Paul envisions, in other words, a cross-centered community so intimately connected that in the body of Jesus, he says the body is so intimately connected that wherever one part of the body goes, everyone else goes. Which means that if one part of the body is hurting, you also feel that hurt. And one part of the body celebrates, you also celebrate. And so you rejoice when those rejoice, and you weep when those who you weep. In other words, when you see somebody cry, you feel their pain. When you see somebody succeed, you celebrate with them. Now that's a little bit, sounds kind of easy, but let's go a little bit deeper here. This idea of what verse 15 is trying to get at. There is, in some sense, when I try to use these words, there's a difference, friends, between sympathy, which is also good, and empathy, which I would argue is deeper and is verse 15. What's the difference? Sympathy and empathy, what's the difference? According to one article I read, the difference is emotion. What do I mean by this? Now let's do a little bit of a word study. Sympathy and empathy both come from the root word pathos, which is feeling, suffering, and feeling. Now the difference is that sympathy comes with the prefix "sim," which means that you feel together. Sim means with or together. And empathy, that prefix "m," it means in, that you feel into. Now what the difference here between sympathy and empathy is this, is that sympathy, you can understand why someone is weeping or celebrating. Empathy, you feel into it, you experience along with them. One is a bit more cognitive. You could understand, you could rationalize, you could sympathize with them. Oh, I understand. That could be really hard and difficult, isn't it? I can imagine. But empathy means you enter into their experience like Jesus did into the human experience. It's not that you could just understand it, but you also feel it. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. That's why empathy and sympathy are quite different in both of them, and some of you are probably this. Some of you may not be either verse 15 empathy, nor are you really sympathy, but you may just be apathy, which you just care about how you feel. Apathy is like you don't care about anything else. You don't have any feelings. And the worst kind of Christian, to be a little bit terse, are those who only feel what they individually feel. I only know my needs, I only know my frustrations, my insecurities, and you make decisions and you live life according to your pathos, what you feel and what you want to do. That's another way just to say that you're just selfish. But those who are other-centered, because the gospel makes us that way, makes us other-centered, we're not just sympathetic and walk alongside people's feelings, but we're empathetic, we enter into their experience. Now, friends, I'm going to confess, and I'm just going to ask you to pray for me. I'm just going to ask you to pray for me. It kind of hits, rubs against a little bit with me. It's a little bit difficult. But when I got, for me personally, that is, but when I got counseling last summer, I was talking to my counselor, and I alluded to this before. My counselor said this. He says, Will, you understand people pretty well. When I talk to you about your church, about yourself, and you reflect upon your family, you understand emotions, you understand how people work. In some sense, I could tell that you're a pastor, did a lot of counseling, you took classes at CCF, and he says, you're really good at that, but I'm waiting for something more. I want you personally to process it. I don't want you just to understand it and to analyze it and to sympathize with it. He wants me to feel it. That's what my counselor said. In other words, what was he saying to me? He's saying, Will, you're a great sympathizer. You're not too good at being an empathizer. You could rationally and cognitively, you could go along with people, you can understand and be able to diagnose and counsel and apply the gospel, but you can't resonate and empathize, enter into or experience into their emotions and feelings. He says, you're a great sympathizer, you're a horrible empathizer. And if I'm honest, then I just felt all frustrated and annoyed with him, but that's probably the reason why I was like that. So pray for me, because even the gospel has to touch me so that I could be able to empathize even deeper, because that's what God did for us when he sent his son Jesus. See, what's interesting about this, as we come to a close now, is that with even empathy, what's really interesting about this is that my guess would be, for most of us, it's much easier for us to empathize with people's sorrows, much harder for you to empathize, which is sort of weird, to empathize with people's successes. It's probably easier for you to weep when people are hurting, much harder for you to celebrate and rejoice with those who are rejoicing. Even on the news, your heart probably breaks a little bit to read all the tragedies and injustices in the world. Your heart doesn't really celebrate, not necessarily for the person, who wins the lottery or wins a Nobel Prize. Your heart doesn't celebrate, I'm so happy for that person, but your heart does break for the injustice and the weeping of the world. And I think there's a reason for that in the human condition. In some ways, it's probably in our sin, in our innate selfishness, that it's easier for us to cry with one another. As they say, misery loves company, but much harder to celebrate with somebody else. Even pastors, once again, pastors, it's easy to commiserate with other pastors when you're saying, I feel like I have depression. I don't know about my ministry. Church is really tough. I don't know how church is going to go. And you can resonate with other pastors also saying the same thing. But you know what? You don't really celebrate and rejoice with the one church and pastor who's saying, COVID-19 has been tough, but my church is thriving. My giving is going to be up. There's leaders here. I love this. People are being baptized. Non-Christians are coming through. In person who's struggling, you don't look at that pastor and say, man, that's fantastic. It's hard to rejoice even though we should. Now, as a parent, I would imagine as a parent, you and your friend, your kids try out to starting lineup in the basketball team, and your kid doesn't make it, and then your friend's kid makes first starting point guard, and there's a little bit like, that's where you get the hypocritical love. Oh, I'm so happy your kid made starting point guard, but deep down inside, I wonder if you're really able to rejoice. That's something in the human condition. We can weep with those who weep, but it's hard for us to rejoice with those who rejoice. That's why I think a truly empathetic person is not someone who just cries with people. A truly empathetic person, one who really has a gift of empathy and the gospel has touched him, is someone who genuinely rejoices with other people. And that's what he calls us to do, an empathetic people. What is a cross-centered community? Someone who could resonate and empathize into other people's experiences, someone who could rejoice with those who rejoice and empathize with those who empathize, weep with those who weep. Now, friends, that's a lot, isn't it? You're thinking, there's no way I could do this, but you can. You can. You know why? You could grow in it. You could do this. You know why? Because someone has already done it for you. Now, Jesus Christ isn't just the perfect man who has done this perfectly. It's not just that Jesus was the most sincere person, the most affectionate person, the perfectly hospitable person, the one who empathizes. Jesus did this. He did celebrate. He celebrated the joys of heaven, but he also wept with those such as Lazarus and those who were hurting. But it's not just to say that Jesus is an example. Now, if we left that and it says, follow Jesus, the perfect sympathizer, perfect empathizer, the perfect affectionate person, showed hospitality perfectly. If I said Jesus is your example, it certainly is true he's our example. But if I left it at that, you basically have Christianized moralism. It's more than that. Throughout the Bible, we see the destruction of community. We saw it first between Adam and God when he ate of that tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And since then, it's set a trajectory in which all communities are broken. That's why we see racism. That's why we see sexism. That's why we see murder. That's why we see hatred. That's why we see today gossip and passive aggressiveness. That's why we see cliques. That's why we see social bullying on social media. All of that is because Adam ate that fruit and set a trajectory of all the communities that we see in this world being totally corrupted, both in the church but also in the civil realm out there. In the political realm, the economic realm, everywhere you see. It's all been broken and busted. The hope is not to tell the world, hey, look at Jesus. He did it well. Follow what he did. No, Christianity is much more powerful than that, friends. You know what Jesus did? He says, I'm going to have a heart and love to enter into your experience and mine, and I'm going to sense and experience a level of separation from the most intimate union that I've had, the Father and the Spirit on the cross. I'm going to separate. I'm going to experience your hell and mine. I'm going to experience being ostracized and being separated and cry out, my God, why have I been forsaken? Why did you kick me out? Why have I been separated? Jesus says, I'm going to enter into the separation that you and I created in our sin so that he could heal us and make us and embrace us so that we can have unity in him. It's not just an example, it's redemption. It's just not moralism, but it's transformation. It's gospel. It's good news. He changes all this for us. And if you looked at Jesus, who just was an example, but also the power that he was on the cross and he experienced the separation from the Father as he was suffering your hell and mine, then he could go back and look and see that he's going to speak into all the brokenness of the communities we see in our families, our marriages, our friendships, our CGs, our DGs, in the civil realm, our workplace. And he says there's a hope in the messiness and brokenness of community that you can live out an antithetical, countercultural, kingdom-centered, cross-centered, gospel-empowered community so that you could be the most sincere, that you could be the most affectionate, the most hospitable, the most empathetic, because Jesus changed you. He entered into your brokenness. He made you whole because on the cross, he was separated and he was broken because of your sin and mine. So if you looked at Jesus, we can grow, we could heal. We could have this cross-centered community that is so necessary in this world. And friends, I pray that you be able to do this and be able to pray and cultivate this in your life, friends. Look to Jesus Christ, not just your example, but also your Savior and your Redeemer. Let's pray at this time, friends.